everybody, and welcome to Fixing a Hole, the Beatles podcast that you didn't know you needed. This is episode 43. Can you believe we're there now? I say that every week, don't I? Can you believe? But we are, so you must have to believe it. My name's Mark Wakely. I'm the producer and the idiot in the room, as I often tell people about this, who knows a bit about the Beatles but not very much. But I am sitting next to the Beatles wizard that we all know and love, Mr. Paul Humbley. Hi, Paul. How are you today?
I'm very well, Mark. Great to be back at Fixing a Hole HQ. As always, recording not just one episode today, but a couple of episodes.
Yeah, we're going to be recording a couple of episodes. If you're going to listen to the next one, it'll be after we've done this one. So there we go. Right then, so anything exciting happened since I spoke to you last week? The answer's no, isn't it? You've been doing the research for these podcasts, haven't you?
Yeah, my life revolves around podcast research and listening, or as has been the case this last week while I've been researching this episode, watching.
Let's talk about this episode. You've put on my sheet here, it's been a hard day and a harder night! Exclamation mark. Please explain, and what are we talking about in the Beatles universe this week?
Okay. In recent weeks, there's been more news from Apple and the director Sam Mendes about the 4 biopics that he's putting together about John, Paul, George and Ringo. And it got me thinking about the Beatles film A Hard Day's Night, which, as we know, is a snapshot of a day in the life of the Beatles. But also recently in one of the podcasts that we put out, we mentioned a couple of other films that aren't Beatles related, but they are Slade In Flame, That'll Be the Day, and its follow-up Stardust. Now, between those 3 films, they tell the story of what it was like to be a teenager in Britain in the 1950s, discover Elvis, Buddy Holly, Fats Domino, etc., Jerry Lee Lewis, and, you know, be bitten by that bug and become a member of a band, write your own songs. If you were lucky, go on to be famous like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, the Small Faces. But they also, most importantly, tell you what it was like behind the scenes, so behind the fame, you know, behind the curtain on the stage, and then what happens when it all starts to go wrong. And it just got me thinking that these 4 films do have a connection, and it's in, you know, when you watch A Hard Day's Night, it's a film that's put across to get a teen audience, but there are sections of it where the Beatles are seen wanting to get away from the fame. And I thought we'd have a conversation about what it was like for the Beatles when they went through their apprenticeship to becoming famous to then it all going wrong.
One of the things about Hard Day's Night, which is one of the great things about the album, certainly, is the fact that it was the first album where they wrote all the songs, wasn't it?
It was.
There was no cover versions on that. And one side of the album was the songs in the film, and the other side were extra songs that were written to fill the album, which is great. I'm a big fan of Slade In Flame. It's one of my favourite films of all time, and we'll go on to talk about that a little bit in a minute. But Hard Day's Night is really good as well. It's wild and wacky, and it's you can see how the Monkees came about after watching Hard Day's Night very much. Yeah. Which is one of the great things about that film is I think it's almost slapstick in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of sort of sides to the camera and that sort of thing. And we're peeping into their funny little world. I think the actual events in the film are the big, you know, being chased around and all that kind of stuff. But also there's obviously some comedy elements in it as well. The whole thing with Wilfrid Brambles and all that sort of thing, which is a comedy aside, really, because do you know what? He's not really Paul's granddad.
And he's very clean.
And he's very, very clean. Yes, which of course is a very much an in-joke of the time. Yeah. Also, it was made in black and white, which is quite interesting as well, because I think, was it United Artists who made the film, I think?
Yeah, United Artists made the film.
And they didn't want to spend the money on the colour film, did they?
Well, yeah, they didn't, because they just assumed that they would make, you know, although they were signed up for, I think it was 4 films, the Beatles, United Artists assumed that they would probably only last as, you know, as a band and as a phenomenon for the lifespan of one film.
Yeah, and they weren't worth spending the money on, basically, were they?
Yeah, and it shouldn't also be forgotten that the only reason that United Artists signed them to do a film is because in America they knew they would get a soundtrack album. So the Hard Day's Night that we get in the UK is not the same album that you get in the United States. And so it gave them access to Beatles songs, which they wouldn't have got.
And the interesting thing about that is that's not the first time we've had that conversation about different albums in America than the ones in the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. Not only that, different quality as well, but that's another story altogether.
Yeah.
So we've talked about these 4 films. So we're talking about A Hard Day's Night with the Beatles. We're talking about Slade In Flame with obviously Slade, made in the 70s, also made in the 70s. That'll Be the Day and Stardust, which are, one is a sort of That'll Be the Day Part 2, I suppose Stardust is.
Yeah.
With a slightly different cast, but a lot of the same people.
Yeah.
What are the connections between these 4 films?
Okay, so with That'll Be the Day and Stardust, the stories are both written by the author and journalist Ray Connolly, and he had direct connection with the Beatles. So throughout their career, he interviewed them. And so he was getting first-hand stories about, not only were what the Beatles were doing at the time of the interviews, but also they would share stories with him about what it was like to have been playing the clubs in Hamburg and playing the Cavern, etc. And he took all of this information from the interviews that he was getting from them, but obviously likewise he was speaking to other bands and artists. And in the early 70s, he wrote the scripts for That'll Be the Day and Stardust. Also, in That'll Be the Day, there's a direct Beatles connection because Ringo actually appears in it. His character returns in Stardust, but by then the part has been recast. And instead of Ringo, it's Adam Faith, who, to be fair, does an excellent job. And we'll come to that.
Well, I think Adam Faith was an actor as well as a pop star, wasn't he? Whereas Ringo was a pop star, but also did a bit of acting.
Yes, yeah. And the Slade In Flame film, although there's no direct, Beatles connection there that I can find, what a lot of people don't realise is that in the early 70s, Slade were the most successful singles group in the UK. There's a caveat on that, which is, UK group. Obviously ABBA had more hits, but if you look at UK artists, they were the most successful singles band. Slade, at the time that this film was made, were living a similar lifestyle to what, the Beatles had done at the time of A Hard Day's Night. They'd also grown up through the same system of going through the clubs, etc. And what is really surprising is that in the 1960s, when it was suggested that the Beatles make a film, they made a film that was very much based on reality of what it was like to be the Beatles. What Slade did was, instead of making a film that was about glam rock and how wonderful it is to be a pop band and some silly storyline, that, more like what the Beatles did with Help, their second film, what Slade did was do a very nitty-gritty film about the truth of what it was like to be a band and to get fame and then realise it's not all what you expect it to be. It's
an incredibly dark film, I think, Slade In Flame. I think right from the very beginning, and the whole club scenes, and the fact that one of the things about it for me is the fact that you see how incredibly working class background they are, and they really did come from those working class backgrounds in the Black Country. Noddy Holder's from Walsall, the others are from Wolverhampton, mm-hmm. And everybody thinks, they're a Birmingham band. Don't tell them that. They get very upset with that kind of thing. I really love Slade In Flame. It's one of my favourite films. There's a pirate radio bit in it as well, which always makes me chuckle a little bit, because it's Tommy Vance who was on the pirate radio stations back in the day. Mm-hmm. But they do it on one of the forts in the Thames Estuary. But, the whole thing is just, it's from, the very start of the band, where they nick the vocalist, which is played by Noddy Holder from another band. And then they go through with an early manager and then later manager, and they get fantastically successful. And then, well, I won't tell you the end, but you can probably guess what the end is. But for me, it is incredibly gritty, more so than any of the others. I know Stardust also follows a similar pattern, but I think for me, Slade In Flame just seems so real.
And I think, if...
It's also a great soundtrack, by the way, and one of the first albums I ever bought with my own money.
So if you're listening to this podcast and thinking, I thought this was a Beatles podcast, why are we talking about a film with Slade in it and, 2 films with David Essex in it? It's because, as I suggested in the intro, there are these Sam Mendes films being made. And I'm always apprehensive about films that tell the stories of bands. Before we started recording, Mark and I were talking about Bohemian Rhapsody and the Elton John Rocket Man film, which I'll put my cards on the table, I don't like. And when it comes to the Beatles, the sort of story films that have been made about, the birth, well, one of them was called The Birth of the Beatles.
And Backbeat and stuff like that.
Backbeat is quite interesting, but I just sit there looking at them thinking, well, that's not accurate, that's out of context, that never happened. And I desperately hope that these Sam Mendes films are going to be truthful and be a bit nitty gritty and tell us things, tell it like it was and not what the legend tells us that it was.
It's the old thing, isn't it, about, is Ringo the best drummer in the world? Oh, he's not the best drummer in the Beatles. That was never said. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of these legendary quotes out there, we're bigger than Jesus. Never said that. The quote that it does come from was taken completely out of context. Mm. I agree with you there. I think one of the problems with the Elton John film, I don't mind, but I love that early Elton John stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think Taron Egerton's really good in it as well. The book is a lot better. I will say that. The Elton John book, if you want to read a load of stuff about Elton John, it's really honest. Elton John is well known for telling the truth about himself and the sort of person he is. And I really like that about him. The Bohemian Rhapsody film is an absolute car crash in my eyes. The times are all over the place. And the fact that Brian May and Roger Taylor were involved in it. And I'm thinking, really? The whole thing about them being on top of the pops and having to mime, that wasn't their first. They didn't do Killer Queen first time. They did Seven Seas of Rhye the first time. And all that sort of thing. The dates are all over the place. And to me, it's all a bit mad. He didn't go and see his parents the day he did Live Aid and all that kind of stuff, with his new friend, his new boyfriend and stuff like that. So for me, that spoils the whole thing. And as my wife said, the person who played her in the Live Aid scene has got the wrong coloured jacket on. She said I was wearing a blue jacket that day when I was at the front.
Well, I was at Live Aid as well.
There we go. You see. Who played you, Paul? Do you know?
I couldn't see him because we was in the distance.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So, but, that's the thing. As we said, and as you were talking to me earlier on, Hard Day's Night came, the Beatles were already where they were.
Yeah.
And it is a reflection of a crazy small period in the time of an already very, very successful band.
And I think what also needs to be said is that when we spoke in detail in a previous podcast about A Hard Day's Night, the film and the style of it is very much based on an American documentary film by the Maysles brothers, who followed the Beatles around
when they first came to the United States, wasn't it? Yeah. All that stuff you see of them in the car or in the hotel room, that's all the film they made, wasn't it?
Yeah. And so there's a lot of this, a lot of Hard Day's Night is based on fact. And because the other films were produced within 10 years of Hard Day's Night, and also, within 10 to 15 years of all of these top bands going through their apprenticeship, or, as in the case of the Beatles, their full life cycle, it was still very fresh in people's minds. So there was a lot of stories to be said. And, and I think if you want to get a true understanding of something of what it was like to have been a teenager with the dream of forming a band, if you watch these 4 films, you're going to get a pretty good idea of the reality. I
think you're right. I think the other thing I think is quite interesting is that I'm going to put my film student hat thing on now, is that it's a time when so the 60s, pop music was still part of the entertainment business. It's all glamorous and stuff, and films that were being made, all the films the Beatles made were either you know, A Day in the Life of the Beatles or sort of fantasy films. You know, if you look at Yellow Submarine and Help. The thing is when we get to the 70s, which is when That'll Be the Day, Stardust and Slade In Flame were made, is that it's the business looking in on itself much more than sort of that slightly pop starry thing. You know, if you look at all the Cliff films, it's all about young people having a great time and stuff like that. It's nothing about how the Shadows got together or anything like that, or how Cliff became a star. Whereas That'll Be the Day is definitely, you know, the way bands like the Stones and the Who and those sort of bands came about by a group of people meeting each other, having an interest in music and so on. I think That'll Be the Day starts off as they work on the fairground, don't they, or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, with that,
which is where they hear the music for the first time.
Yeah, with That'll Be the Day, it's very much centred around the Jim McClane character, who's played by David Essex. And what you very quickly start to understand is he's very single-minded. So it starts off with him going to school to do his final exams, and his parents have got hopes he's going to go to university. And on the way to school, he throws all his books away and basically runs away to the fun fair. He is a little bit of quadrophenia in there as well, isn't there? Yeah, there is. But again, with quadrophenia, a lot of that is rooted in fact. Yeah. Which is, again, why I think it's such a good album. And, you know, the Jim McClane character, the one thing that comes through the two films is he is so single-minded to his own detriment that he uses people. You know, he gets girls pregnant, he leaves his wife, he splits up with his band because he is just totally focused on fame and he wants it more than the other people around him. And when you read a lot of biographies of, you know, of musicians from that era, that is one of the things that comes out. It is literally, you know, I'm going to do it my way or no way. And again, that's why I think these films are so entrenched in the reality of what it was like.
I agree with you. I think that's one of the great things about the three films that we're looking at after Hard Day's Night is that, you know, they pull no punches. And when you look at anyone who became a big star, whether it's David Bowie or Brian Ferry or any of these people, Mark Bolan, you know, they had a certain amount of single-mindedness about what they were doing and who they were. And they collected people around them as well. I think that's really interesting. One of the things for me about Slade In Flame is it is about the band as opposed to the individuals in the band. Yeah. And the band don't split up because of an individual ego. They split up because they've had enough, basically. And they've had enough of the exploitation. That's the interesting part about that.
We're recording this in 2016, you know, and you've got a band like the Rolling Stones who 60 plus years later are still making music together. Back in the 70s, it was very much, you know, a band like the Rolling Stones was seen as, even then, as a bit of a dinosaur. Nobody realised that groups like that could go on. And, you know, and if you look at bands in the 60s, there's actually very few that carry on in the same form into the 70s and beyond. And I think what Slade In Flame demonstrates is exactly why, because their managers would see them as product. And as far as the managers were concerned, the fact that they were a pop band didn't really matter. What mattered was they were a pop band that was selling records. They could have been washing machines or could have been cars. As long as they sold, that's all that mattered.
It's something I remember when I joined the music business, and I couldn't believe that they just called it product all the time.
Product.
And I thought they might as well be selling marmalade here. You know, I'm getting excited about a brand new Order album coming out, which was a low life at the time. And they're going, oh yeah, we can sell lots, you know, we can sell big numbers of this product and stuff. And I'm thinking, but what about the songs? Yeah. And you know, if you're in the business, you know, I didn't know many people in the music business who actually liked new music. Most of them were into, you know, Northern Soul or jazz or something like that. And it was just a job for them. Whereas for me, it was an immersive thing. I think the other thing about all of this is that in the 60s and 70s, we couldn't imagine those bands still doing what they're doing in their 60s and 70s. Yeah. Whereas if you look now, Paul McCartney's still out there doing it. The Who are still out there. Well, they've just retired, haven't they? But they're all in their well into their 70s. The Rolling Stones are still out there doing it. You know, everybody, Ray Davies, Peter Gabriel, Genesis have only just stopped. Yeah. Genesis have only stopped because Phil Collins can't physically do it anymore. As you say, the Eagles, all these bands. And there's a great chapter in one of David Hepworth's books called The Kids Need New Shoes. And he's saying the problem is with these bands is that they are now massive multi-employment businesses, and they've got to pay for all these people. So they've got to go out on tour because they can't make any money out of recording anymore. They've got to go out on tour and play the same songs they've been playing for years and years and years.
Yeah.
You know, if you go along to a Coldplay gig and they don't play Yellow, everybody gets very upset, or they don't play Fix You. And I think it's the same with all these massive bands. You know, when you're waiting for The Who, you do not want to hear the songs they wrote in the 1980s. What you want to hear is, you know, Won't Get Fooled Again and Barbara O'Reilly, ironically from the same album. And I think this is the thing. Even I couldn't have imagined back in the early 70s, people still doing the same thing, you know, in 2026. But they're still out there. And U2, you know, they're still out there, same lineup, still playing the same songs and still recording albums.
And I think what's ironic is when you watch these films, you know, in particular Slade In Flame and Stardust, the artists are wanting to move on and get away from playing the same thing. Whereas now, as you've just quite rightly said, it's all gone full circle. And where the money is for the artist, because they can't make money selling CDs and albums, you know, nobody makes money out of streaming. The only way they can do it is by doing greatest hits tours.
Absolutely.
And almost becoming a tribute band of themselves.
Well, you know, the crazy thing is that Avril Lavigne's last tour was the greatest hits tour.
Yeah.
And she's Avril Lavigne. You know, to me, she's still a young girl. I think she's in her 40s now. But, you know, even so, when you think about that, and they're still out there playing the same songs over and over and over again. I mean, I don't know how sick they get of playing those songs.
Yeah.
They must get very sick. But Elton John, you know, when he played at Glastonbury, which is his last UK gig, you know, he just went through all the hits.
Yeah.
Simple as that. Finished off with Rocket Man.
As did Paul McCartney the year before.
There we go.
Yeah.
And I've seen Neil Young there, and he did the same thing. And I've seen Bruce Springsteen there.
The
Stones. They've all just banged out those hits. U2, I saw there. You know, even the Foo Fighters, to a certain extent, will still play the same songs. I think the interesting thing about Slade and Slade In Flame as a film is they made that film and then they were on the wane by that point. It's more to the end of their, what I would call their successful period, although they carried on and they came back again in the early 80s. But, you know, the singles that came off that, two of the records I really love of theirs, much preferred to the foot stompy ones, is Far, Far Away. And, of course, How Does It Feel, which is my and Paul's favourite song of all time. Or one of my favourite songs of all time. But both were singles. Neither of them got to number one.
No. But what's interesting as well is, when you mentioned Slade, is when Slade In Flame came out, I went to see it. I understand this. What we expected to see was a glam rock film.
We thought, it's a jukebox film, what they would call a jukebox film.
And to put it into context,
it wasn't.
At a similar time, there was a film, and I forget what the title is. It could be something like Never Too Young to Rock, but don't quote me on that, which had the Rubettes and Mud in it. And I think during the closing of the film,
quite pleased that one passed me by.
During the closing of the film, they meet up at a cafe, and there's some sort of pie fight, you know, custard pie fight, and you're thinking, what is that all about? But that was the sort of thing you thought might happen, or you know, you was expecting Slade In Flame to maybe be a help, because we were used to, you know, Help, the Beatles film, led on to the Monkees TV series. So you had this impression, you know, as a young lad that I was at the time, that all these pop groups lived in the same house, and you know, because that's what you saw the Monkees.
Well, according to Vic and Bob, they do, don't they?
That wasn't the reality of it, and what Slade In Flame was actually almost like a documentary.
Yeah.
But the strange thing is, I can remember coming away, and I just, it's almost like I watched it once. I never saw it again till it came out on DVD in the 90s, I think it was. But when I watched the DVD again, I could remember everything. It really did ingrain itself in my memory bank.
And the interesting thing about that as well is it was an entire album of new songs. There was they weren't playing, Come On Feel the Noise and all those, and Mama We're All Crazy Now and stuff.
Yeah.
They came out with a whole new set of songs. Mm-hmm. And, some people would say that would have been suicide, but no. Yeah. As I said, I think retrospectively, it's probably their creative peak, I think, that period. That's my personal feeling, because I'm much more... I much prefer those songs on that album than the big foot stompers from earlier on in the career.
Yeah.
Not that I didn't love the earlier songs at the time. I used to wait on Top of the Pops for the Slade to come on. It was very much, that was the thing. Mm-hmm. But that's the thing. Oh, but also Hard Day's Night, wasn't it? They were all new songs when they came out. So, but I think the Beatles were still on the up, whereas Slade, I think, had probably reached the end of their creative powers.
Well, they were about to lose their stranglehold on the charts. That for people,
we talk about Slade.
Slade. But for after the film came out, they pursued fame in America. They'd done various tours of America, but they decided that they would go there and break America, and it never happened. And by the time they came back to the UK, punk had happened, and it took probably another 5 years. Well, famously, they play Reading as a stand-in for Ozzy Osbourne and Bring the House Down.
Literally Bring the House Down.
Yeah, and they have a hit single with We'll Bring the House Down.
Exactly.
And then there's more chart success with My Oh My, and they get this second breath of fame.
Did you know that Noddy Holder was nearly the vocalist of Led Zeppelin?
No.
Yeah, he was one of the people that Jimmy Page contacted.
I didn't.
And he said, "Oh no, I'm doing something else at the moment, but I know a bloke." Mm-hmm. Because they're all from the other two are from that area, aren't they? Robert Plant and John Bonham, which is quite, and they must have all played the same clubs and knew each other very well. So I find that quite interesting. But Noddy Holder has got an amazing voice. Did have an amazing voice. Let's look at That'll Be the Day now. My feeling about that film, it's a long time since I've seen it, and I do remember seeing it at the time, and I was very much into, music and bands and all that sort of thing. So it really interested me in, them buying guitars and things like that. I think there's a bit of darkness about it. It's quite a dark film, I think. Because I think all the fairground stuff's a little bit...
Yeah. It's
and don't they do a residency at a holiday camp at some point as well? Yeah. And it's all the same kind of goings on.
Yeah, it's for those people that have not seen That'll Be the Day in Stardust. The lead character is a guy called Jim McLean. He's played by David Essex, who, to put it in context, was one of the big solo stars of the 1970s.
He'd played Jesus Christ in Jesus Christ Superstar on the West End, didn't he, and stuff like that.
And again, similarly with Slade, you would have expected David Essex to play, a jolly, lovable character that followed his career success. Whereas what he actually does is play this teenager who leaves school early, has he's got no qualifications, doesn't go to university as is hoped, runs away to a fairground, meets Ringo Starr, who works on the fairground on the Dodgems. And that's when the darkness starts, because Ringo is showing him all the tricks of the trade, how you can basically rob the customers by not giving them the right change or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then it moves on that, during the winter months, nobody goes to the fair. During the summer months, you can leave the fairgrounds and go to the holiday camps. And as we know, Ringo with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes played Butlins. And so there's a whole section which is based around holiday camps. You see this group who play the nightclub at the holiday camp, which is a group called Stormy Tempest, which is made up of Billy Fury, Keith Moon on drums, several other sort of, big players, from the music scene at the time. And Jim McLean is watching these, and what he starts to see is, if you're in a group, it attracts girls, which when you're a teenager, is something that you want to do. It then sort of sidetracks into, he goes from being a very naive young man into somebody who has a better understanding, shall we say, of how the facts of life work. He then realises that this isn't something that he can keep doing, and he ends up going home, working in his parents' shop. But again, he's got this drive. He wants to be famous, and he leaves the shop and goes to a music shop, buys a guitar, and that's the end of the film. It then picks up with Stardust, and as I mentioned earlier, the Ringo character is now played by Adam Faith, and he is very much playing the Mal Evans character, that, you know,
sort of personal assistant.
So, you know, he's driving the minibus, he's setting the instruments up on stage, but he's also the fixer. If somebody isn't pulling their weight in the band, he's the one who sorts it out, and it's always, would you like to come for a drink? And he like puts his arm round them, and then you never see that person again.
But do you think a lot of what's in that film has come from the writer and his experience with interviewing bands in the 60s, specifically the Beatles, and the characters around the Beatles? Do you think there's a reflection there?
Absolutely. And when you watch or listen to interviews with Ray Connolly, it is all very much based on fact and based on what he witnessed, or what, you know, people like Paul McCartney, John Lennon, you know, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards told him. And so in Stardust, you then see this band go from travelling around the UK playing clubs in a I think it's an old ambulance they've got, to making their first record, to then becoming, you know, the big group, and all the mania starts. But very, very quickly, it then becomes, you know, Jim McClane wants to go off and, you know, make his Sgt. Pepper, which then means he gets rid of the group and, you know, goes his own way. But what is really interesting as well, which is very much aligned to the Beatles story, he parts ways with his manager. Not that he's expecting to, it just happens. And all of a sudden, this new manager, who's an American, played by Larry Hagman, who you'd know from Dallas, and he just turns up and says, "Hi, Jim, I'm your new manager. Right, can you record a new album? They all need to be your own compositions, and it's going to be released in 3 months." And you start to see the realities of what it's like to be an artist who's reached the pinnacle, and there's only one way you can go now, which is down. I think the interesting thing about that is we can name plenty of people who've fallen down that trap. You know, I think of Robbie Williams, who turned a very self-indulgent person, mired in various substances. I think, you know, to a certain extent, Freddie Mercury very nearly fell down that hole, but obviously pulled himself back from that after a while. But I think the superstardom just takes you over, and you become so self-indulgent. You know, the classic one, of course, is Elton John. I mean, at one point he sacked all his band crazily, but then they all came back in the end. But I think one of the things for me with Stardust is, and I look at that and you know, that you end up in this sort of almost like a mountain villains sort of castle type thing, which is painful. It reminds me a lot of two people, which is Eric Clapton and Brian Wilson. And those two who just descended into this mayhem of their lives. I mean, Clapton's, well, we don't talk about it anymore, but you know, these people just descended because they were so famous and so rich and had everything they ever wanted. And I just wonder, it's really hard to keep your feet on the ground. And I think that the Jim McClane character does that as well. And I think what you see happening is, you know, if you're, you know, a major artist, be that, you know, a musician or an actor, you can either stay grounded, which, you know, you can argue Paul McCartney has, or you believe your own legend. And I think it's very interesting. You know, Paul McCartney always says there's me, and then there's Paul McCartney, the person that the public know. That's a different person to him. Whereas, you know, I think what this film shows you is, as you quite rightly said, people like Elton John went off the rails because they believe their own legend. Yeah, and because the trouble is that these people also attract
parasites, for the want of a better word, whether they're drug dealers or whether they're people who want them to sign merch deals or whatever, and try and, screw some money out of these people, basically, because they feel they've got all the money. Why shouldn't I have some? And there's a lot goes on. I think some management are a bit like that as well. And you notice that the bands who tend to be relatively successful for a long period of time have the same managers. I mean, Stones have managed themselves, I think, for a long period of time. But when you look at Paul McGuinness of U2, he's almost the fifth member of that band, and is very much part of that thing. The other thing, quickly, is about all these films have stars of the period in them. Okay, people who've been through the process, for the want of a better phrase, and have done their apprenticeships within that sort of slightly grimy club world, and your first manager who's also the bloke who runs the bingo hall and all that sort of thing. Do you think that gives them, as in their acting, but also in the whole films, a very good insight into what really happens?
Yeah, I think I think that's a very, very good point, because I think with the films about groups or artists that I think fail, you've always got an actor playing the part. And this is what concerns me about these 4 biopics about the Beatles that are being made. Whereas if you were going to put any criticism about all of these films, and and I include A Hard Day's Night in that, is that none of the people are actors. They are musicians first. Some of David Essex acting in That'll Be the Day, is very questionable. But when it comes to the music part of it, he's very believable. And I think that's a huge tick in the box for why these 4 films are very successful.
Yeah, it's a little bit like if you've seen Escape to Victory, which is a football film set in the Second World War, and it's full of really well-known footballers who were very well-known at the time, and then Sylvester Stallone is playing in goal. And you can see how the footballers, there's Pele's in it, and Bobby Moore, and Mickey Summerby, and a lot of well-known footballers. I think Osvaldo Ardiles is in it as well. But I quite find that quite, because you can see that Sylvester Stallone hasn't got a clue about anything to do with football at all, which I find quite funny. But yeah, you're right about the fact that, these are pop stars first, or, musicians first, who are playing musicians. And I think the funniest thing about Slade In Flame, looking very quickly back at that, is that it is Slade playing Slade, but with a different name. Which I think is quite interesting. They're all doing exactly the same things they do in the band, and incredibly well acted, to be honest. For people who weren't trained actors, I thought it was incredibly well acted.
And I think it's because of the script reflected their life and, and what they'd been through, so they could relate it to something. Whereas I think if they had been told, right, here's a script, you're going to be playing the Monkees 2, they would have been lost.
They wouldn't have done it, I don't think. I don't think that was what Slade were about at all. For all their glam rock and silliness and Dave Hill and his mad clothes, which apparently was all Dave Hill's decision, I think first and foremost they were a jobbing rock and roll band, and that was their reason to exist, I think. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for all your work on that and all your research on that. So if people want to get in contact with us, what's the best way to get in contact with us?
They can email us at info@fixingahole.co.uk or direct message us via our Facebook page, which, believe it or not, is called Fixing a Hole.
Just search for Fixing a Hole on Facebook and you'll find our page on there. A lovely blue logo that we have of them walking across the Abbey Road crossing. There's other ways as well people can get involved, as well as emailing us and going onto the Facebook. We've also got a Patreon community group as well. So if you have a look at patreon.com/fixingahole, there's also a link in the show notes to the Patreon page as well. Go and have a look at that. We've got lots of extra stuff on that. We've got extra length episodes. We've also got special episodes that you won't have heard on the normal stream, and other bits of information and stuff as well, which is Paul's putting up new stuff there all the time. So have a look on that. It's not expensive at all, and we'd love you to be part of that community. So please come and join us there. Right then, so that's 43 done. What's going to happen in 44, Paul?
February 2026 marks the 59th anniversary of the single Strawberry Fields Penny Lane being released. So I thought we'd have a look at that single, but we're going to actually have a look at the single, in context. So what was going on in the charts, and let's see if we can answer the question, why did it never make number one in the UK?
Because people are stupid. Right, anyway. That's fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Paul. We'll see you next Sunday with another Fixing a Hole podcast, the Beatles podcast you didn't know you needed.
This is a 1386 audio production.